Hi again, and this is part 2 of the modernization project and the how-to video. We're going to be looking at the last two parts of this project, which will be due at the end of the second week of modernization. So this is the guidelines again. Notice it still got the section that we're going to add with the subsections. The last video covered this subsection here and this subsection here, so we're going to go down to culture and attitudes, which is directly from the Englehart and Welzel, as well as a Welzel article that we read a couple of weeks ago. So the first thing, you notice I got a couple of more links for you. The first thing that we're going to look at is whether the country is in a agricultural or an agrarian society, whether it's an industrial society, or whether it's a post-industrial society, which is very important for the Englehart and Welzel theory. So we'd like to get a sense of where our country is in that process of human development and economic growth. Here is the first link, which goes to a Wikipedia list of countries by GDP sector composition. Basically all that means is that they Basically, all that means is that they take the GDP and they break it down by the percent of the GDP in the agricultural sector, the industrial sector, and the service sector. That gives us a really good idea about where in the process of economic development our country is. Now, this first table is an incomplete table. We're going to skip past it. The second table is also an incomplete table. Now, this is not one we're going to use for this project, but in a couple of weeks this is going to be really important because this is GDP from natural resources. So keep this in mind, that this is, when we look up something for the second to last week in class, we're going to be using this table. It's going to be very helpful. But that's not what we want right now. We want a list of all countries by the percentage. So this is this big old table here, and today we're going to look up Malaysia, just because it's a country that pops in my head. Notice that the first column is the agricultural sector, the second is the industrial, and the third is the services. And service sector is the percent of this is a good indication that is in a postmodern, or a post-industrial society. Remember that in a post-industrial society, according to Englehart and Welzel, the economy shifts towards service, where knowledge and interactions with other humans becomes really important. And so this is what they're actually talking about, is this third column. Nonetheless, let's go down to Malaysia. Where are you, Malaysia? There you are. So 12% is in the agricultural sector, which means that it's moved from an agrarian society. 40% is in the industrial sector, and then 48% is in the service sector. Now, avoid the temptation to look at this being the service sector being the largest percent and saying, oh, well, look, it's a post-industrial society. It actually is not. And we could compare it to the world, but a better way to do this would be compare it to a couple of countries that we know are at the extreme ends of the scale. On the one hand, we have the United States, which we know is a post-industrial country, and on the other, we have Somalia, which we know is a very agrarian society. So let's compare it to both of those countries. Down here, when we get to Somalia, look at this. 60% of the Somalian economy is in the agrarian sector. Only 7.4% is in the industrial, and about 32.5% is in the service sector. So that clearly shows that Somalia is an agrarian society. A large majority of their economy is wrapped up in agriculture. Let's go to the United States now. And you see that only 1.2% is in the agricultural society. About 19% is in the industrial society, but look at this, 80% of the U.S. economy is wrapped up in the service sector. That is clearly a post-industrial society. And so what we make of this, comparing Malaysia to both Somalia, which is agrarian, and the U.S., which is post-industrial, we'll go back to Malaysia real quick. Notice a breakdown for Malaysia. It means that Malaysia is still an industrial society. We could say that they might be moving more towards post-industrialism, and I think that's probably accurate given what I know about Malaysia. But nonetheless, this is clearly between Somalia, which is agrarian, and the United States, which is post-industrial. So we would say that Malaysia is somewhere around the industrial stage of development. So that's the first part of the assignment, and that'll help you fill out this part right here in the template. Next, let's go to values and attitudes. Now, we cannot go and conduct surveys of our own to find out what people's attitudes are in the country, so we're going to rely on Engelhardt and Welzell's, their surveys. And they were instrumental in creating what's called the World Value Survey. All of the data they present in their book come from this survey. And they were nice enough to put this online. I've got a link right here, you can see it. If you click on the link, you're going to see this page, and I'm going to try to expand this a little bit, make it a little bigger so we can see it. There we go. I know it's probably very small on your video. If you don't get to this page, look for data and documentation, and then go down to online analysis, and it'll take you here. The first thing you have to do is you have to choose what they call a wave. They do not ask questions for every country every year. They have what they call waves of surveys. So they might, for instance, between 2010 and 2014, they might interview people in Malaysia. But in 2005 and 2009, they might not. So what you're going to want to do is find the wave that corresponds as close as possible to your country's transition. If your country transitioned in 1998, for instance, you'd want to try this wave first. And then if you can't find the data for that wave, go to the one previously, and if you can't find it there, go to the one after that. And just keep searching until you find the wave that has data for your country that's closest to the point of transition. Now, I will tell you there are some countries you're not going to find any of this data for, and that's okay. I'm going to tell you how to do that. If you look at the guidelines, there's some helpful hints about what to do in that case. But if you're doing North Korea, you're not going to find this because North Korea does not allow researchers into their country to interview their people. It doesn't happen. So there may be one wave possibly that has North Korea, but you're probably not going to find the data you're looking for. The other thing I'm going to tell you up front is that there's not going to be data for every question for every country for every wave. So some of this is going to feel like a jigsaw puzzle. You're going to find as many different questions as you can for your country, and then as best you can, piece it together to figure out where your country is in terms of its attitudes and values. So for this one, we're going to go to 2010 and 2014, and you just go and find your countries here, and you click over beside it. I've already selected Malaysia, which is what we're going to use for this project example, and then we're going to compare it to Rwanda and the United States. I could do Somalia like we did before, however, but notice that Somalia is not on here. So they didn't ask Somalia in 2010, 2014. So there you go. By the way, if your country is not democratic, if it never experienced a transition like Malaysia, then choose the most recent. So in this case, this is 2010, 2014 is the most recent wave of surveys. So we're gonna look at Malaysia now, or at least as most recently as we can. If we were doing Somalia, we'd have to go to a previous wave, and that's all right. So what questions are we going to ask? First of all, if we click Next, we've chosen our 3 countries to compare. We click Next, and look, we've got a list of survey questions. I'm going to get rid of that. There are going to be a lot of questions. We're going to need to search for specific questions related to the readings. How do we find that? Well, the best first starting point is the Welzell article. Remember, we read that last week, hopefully, and Welzell has this really nice figure 1 where he breaks down the attitudes into democratic preferences, communal attitudes, and emancipative attitudes. And we're going to want to find questions related to each one of these types of attitudes. It's really nice because he has the name of the question up here: reject army rule. Emphasize people power. There's also an emancipative orientation. So let's look for that one first, because emancipative attitudes are the best predictors of democracy, according to Welzell and also Engelhardt and Welzell. So let's just look up this emancipative orientation. We go over here and we type emancipative, if I can type it correctly. Oh, look. First thing, emancipative values. This is the question that Welzell used for this graph. That's the nice thing about this website, is that this has all of the data that is presented in the tables for Welzell and Engelhardt and Welzell's book. So we're just going to go look up their data for our country ourselves. You have to go over here to show, and you click that, and you're going to get this table. Now, the scale itself, these numbers don't mean anything. Just understand that the higher it is, the higher that country scores on emancipative attitudes. So we could just look at the mean, which is the average, and compare it. You notice the United States has the highest average of emancipative attitudes. Rwanda has the lowest in the countries we selected. And Malaysia is much closer to Rwanda than it is to the United States. The United States, the average is 0.54. For Rwanda, it's 0.31, and Malaysia, it's 0.36. So we can see right there that Malaysia is rather low on the emancipative orientation. That would, of course, predict that they would not be a democratic country, and they are not. So based on this one metric, and you never want to rely on one metric, but based on this metric, this would give us a hint that the attitudes in Malaysia are not as conducive to democracy as, say, in the United States. If you want to, you can also look at the distribution across the values. You can see the United States, the attitudes are spread somewhere around the middle. And for Rwanda and Malaysia, they're at the low end. They're just sort of clustered over here. The biggest percentages are right there in the middle. For this one, though, I would recommend just looking at the mean. For others that we're going to search for, you can look at the distribution. All right, so that's one. We've got one measure for emancipative attitudes. You will want to go and find as many of these from this chart or this graph as possible. You do not want to rely on one measure. The emancipative orientation is a good one, but it's not the only one. So let's look for a couple of others. Reject strong leader. You notice this is one of the democratic preferences, one of the indicators for that. Well, let's go back. Notice we're in the responses tab. We go over to the survey question tab right here. And it brings us back, and we just type in strong leader. Oh, look, having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament and elections, you can hopefully understand how that would indicate preference for democracy. And the question's going to be, do you agree or disagree, or is this very good or not good? Is it very good or very bad to have a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with elections and parliament? Notice that in the United States, the vast majority of people said that it's bad or very bad. 26.2% said bad, 37.2% said very bad. Only, and this may be disturbing to some people, but 34% of Americans still said it was very good or fairly good to have a leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections. That may be shocking to some people, but nonetheless, that's considered a low value. Notice Rwanda, they actually, shockingly, higher number of people than the United States said that's bad or very bad to have a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with elections and parliament. And then you go over to, and very few people said it was good. But then you go over to Malaysia, and actually about almost a majority of Malaysians said that it's very good or good to have a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with elections. So you can see that in Malaysia, the attitudes are less conducive again to democracy than they are in the United States, and also Rwanda. Here, in terms of this scale, Rwanda is much closer, actually much higher than slightly higher than the United States. in terms of democratic preferences than in Malaysia. So Malaysia, again, based on this metric, we would look at it and we would say that this is that Malaysia has attitudes that are less conducive to democracy. Let's go back to the survey questions. I'm going to look up one more. I'm kind of riffing here. Let's pick one. Let's say trust political institutions. We're just going to type trust. Most people can be trusted. That's not what we want. How much do you trust? Oh, you know what? This is not in there. So that's okay. We can't use that, but that's okay. We'll use something else. Let's see if that communal orientation is there. Nope. And let's say trust people. If we go back to this, you notice that one of the emancipative attitudes is how much you trust other people, and so that would be this variable here. Most people can be trusted. Let's compare the three countries on that metric. There we go. So most people can be trusted. We're looking for higher attitudes on this. Notice the United States, about 34.8% said most people can be trusted. I'll tell you, that's actually, as I understand it, that's a little lower than most advanced industrial democracies. Nonetheless, compared to Rwanda, which is 16.6%, and especially Malaysia, which is 8.5%, United States is much higher on that emancipative attitude. So again, I'm just trying to show you how to use this to get some of the numbers from the Welzel article. And lastly, we'll go back to survey questions. You do not want to just stick with the Welzel table. You also want to look at tables 2.3 and table 2.4 in the Engelhardt and Welzel book. That's chapter 2, obviously. Go and look at those tables. They list all of the questions from the World Value Surveys that correspond to the different attitudes. And I've chosen two of them. One is a self-expression attitude, which asks, do men on average make better leaders than women? So we're going to type in leaders, and you notice, on the whole, men make better political leaders than women do. Let's compare the attitudes on that. What we're looking at for is a disagree and strongly disagree. If you strongly disagree or disagree with that statement that men make better political leaders than women, then that reflects an emancipative attitude. If you agree with it, it reflects not an emancipative attitude. So we're looking for high values here. Notice that the vast majority of people in the United States disagree with that statement. They think that women make just as good political leaders as men. Nonetheless, about 19% do agree with it. But compare that to Rwanda, where, yeah, majority, but only a slight majority disagree with the statement. And in Malaysia, where only about 30% of the people disagree with that statement. In other words, somewhere around 69 to 70% of people in Malaysia, they agree that men make better political leaders than women. So again, here we see that Malaysia falls low on those self-expression attitudes and low on those attitudes that would predict democracy. And finally, one last one from the Engelhardt and Welzel tables. One of the secular rational attitudes has to do with, is the purpose in life to make your parents proud? So we're going to type in parents, and one of my main goals in life has been to make my parents proud. Let's click on that, look at the table. Agree and agree strongly would indicate lower values for democracy. It would indicate lower values on the secular rational. And look, only if you go down to disagree or strongly disagree, only about 2% of Malaysians disagree with that statement. Only about 11% or 12% of Rwandans do, but over 20% of the United States does. So in terms of, and you can also look at agree strongly, almost 70% of Malaysians agree strongly with the idea that one of the main goals in life, make your parents proud. Only about half of Rwandans do, and only 22% of Americans strongly agree with that. Although, yes, 55% do agree with it, but you can compare the strongly agree and then the strongly disagree across the countries and see that the United States has much higher levels of secular rational values than do Malaysia, and they are somewhat higher than Rwanda. So once again, not to beat a dead horse, but here again in Malaysia, we find that the attitudes are such that they would predict lower levels of democracy in that country. So that's it, and I would just tell you that follow through this video. You may have to watch a video 1 or 2 times to really understand the World Values Survey, but the process, if you gotta get lost in the weeds here, just go back to this table from the Welzell article and just try to find as many of these different items as you can to piece together an idea about what is the level of democratic preferences, communal attitudes, and emancipative attitudes in your country, and then compare it to a country that you think is high on those and a country that you suspect might be lower on those. Just to give you an idea about where your country fits in there. And then after you've done all that, after you get a clear sense of what the political attitudes, what the emancipative, communal, and democratic preferences are in your country, you again would ask, is that consistent with the level of democracy in the country that you examined in the first project? So we're basically asking, does modernization predict the level of democracy in the country? When Malaysia, based on this, just a couple of things that I highlighted here, the answer would be, yeah, it is consistent that you do not have democracy in Malaysia, and that the attitudes and the metrics we use to measure modernization and self-expression attitudes, they are very low in Malaysia. Malaysia has a lower GDP per capita. It has lower emancipative attitudes. Based on this, if you're doing Malaysia, you need to do a more complete analysis here. But based on what I've shown you here, we would say that that Malaysia is in an industrial society, and that the values and beliefs are largely consistent with what we would expect in an industrial society. And because those values and beliefs are lower in terms of self-expression, secular rational, and emancipative attitudes, the modernization theory would predict that Malaysia would not be democratic, which is consistent with what we found. That's what you're doing with this project. And I don't want it to sound overly complicated. Underneath the surface, it's actually really simple. You just try to get a sense of where your country is in terms of economic development. You find out what the attitudes are. You determine, is that what we'd expect based on Engelhardt and Welzell, and does that correctly predict the level of democracy in your country? And that's it. All right, see you next time, and should have 1 or 2 more how-to videos in future weeks.